Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for your patience as we work through some technical difficulties on our end. I'd like to thank you all for coming to today's technology panel on technology, a double-edged sword. As we all know, technology is a powerful tool for innovation and disruption, but it has a dark side. An industry formed to democratize access to goods and services and improve lives through productivity is now a major driver of inequality in society. So today we would like to discuss how do we balance the benefits that technology provides with the concentration of wealth and power that it creates. How can we use technology as a tool for good to address societal problems? And to discuss this very complex topic, we have three incredible guests here today. First, I'd like to introduce Kimberly Bryant, the founder and CEO of Black Girls Code. Kimberly, thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And secondly, I would like to welcome Elise Smith, the co-founder and CEO of Praxis Labs.
Hello. Thank you so much for having this conversation. I'm excited for it.
Thank you, Elise. Looking forward to talking more about this. And lastly, we have Eric Brynjolfsson, a senior fellow at the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI and the director of the Stanford Digital Economy Lab. Thanks, Eric, for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting us, Kelsey. It's great to be here.
Great. And before we dive too deep in, I just want to remind everyone that we do have the QR codes within the room to submit your chats, any questions you have into the chat, and we will spend the last 10 minutes going through audience Q&A. That, however, we're going to try and run a few minutes over here given all of the technical difficulties. So appreciate everyone's patience. Thank you. All right. And so to dive right in here, I think I'd like to kick this off by starting with the dark side and asking all three of you, where have you personally witnessed technology have a negative impact on society? And what do you think are the biggest threats that technology creates? So Kimberly, I'd like to hear from you first, from both your own experience as an employee in tech and then also as a CEO and co-founder of a nonprofit trying to target some of these issues.
Yeah, so I think there been several examples throughout history of ways that technology has had a detrimental effect on individuals, whether intentional or not. I would say I'm an electrical engineer by trade, so not brought up in the technology field from most of my career until I started Black Girls Code. But there have been many instances, even in technology from an engineering standpoint, where we have seen innovations come to life or innovations be tested and they not take into account all of the various potential users or consumers of that technology. One example that's very tangible that engineers like to use all the time, or at least female engineers, is this concept of when seat belts were being designed for automobiles and the engineers who were testing this new technology, if you will, they were only using those test dummies that were modeled after a man's physique. And it had a potential to have a very detrimental impact for women who are also going to be driving these cars. I think we see similar instances of this technology not being fully designed for all of the consumers now when we think about artificial intelligence. So there have been many studies that have been done over the last several years. Certainly, some of those research studies done by Dr. Joy of Algorithmic Justice that talks about how artificial intelligence has been designed or had been designed in some instances by some very large companies such as Amazon and such, that it didn't even register certain people of color in the technology. We were not being able to detect it by this technology, or ways in which artificial intelligence, which is supposed to teaches itself all of the negative indications of individuals in society, and it actually becomes very racist in how it teaches itself, because we have to teach the technology. Someone has to teach it that. So there is bias built into the tech, and oftentimes I think we even see this now as we go into Web3 and the metaverse is being designed in a very decentralized ways, there are less controls. So I think in thinking about what that means for us from a technology standpoint is something that we have to think about, and why it's important that we have diversity in the field.
Thank you for sharing your perspective on that. It's clear that this was an issue in the past that's permeated with the example of the seatbelt, but obviously still continues today. So, Elise, I'd love to get your take on this as well. Kind of same question: where have you personally witnessed some of the negative impacts of technology?
Yeah, I mean, I would double click on everything Kimberly just shared, right? I think technology is a tool that is created and used by humans, and it reproduces the biases that we hold, whoever is in that room creating it. And so, whether you're building that seatbelt, who are the folks who are around the table designing it, or you're designing that computer vision system or that data system or that algorithm? Who are the folks around the table? And so often those folks aren't coming from the diversity of the end user and aren't thinking about all of those potential reproduced, because of the algorithmic nature of it, outcomes. I think, and it can be relatively harmless, from that computer vision or sight detecting water faucet not picking up darker skin, and I'm standing and trying to wash my hands and it's not working for me but working for everyone else. Annoying, not a huge life outcome. But to some of the studies Kimberly was mentioning, when facial recognition software, when people are touting that it's 97% accuracy rate, but the population and data set that it was trained on was 77% male and 83% white, and that there's actually an 35% error rate for darker skinned women. And when that computer vision system is being used by law enforcement for identification purposes, that error rate really means that one in every 3 women of color are not being ID'd correctly. And that is, pair that with the justice system already disproportionately locking away Black and brown bodies. Like, you can see the kind of impact that just builds on itself. And so for me, it's really about, how do we think about the designers of these systems, of these tools, of these processes? How do we get more diversity in the room, but also unlearn some of the ways that we've been told to create and build, and relearn new ways that are more thoughtful and more intentional around equitable outcomes for all?
Thank you for sharing, Elise. I mean, those error rates are quite alarming and a clear major indicator of why there needs to be such systemic change and how we're designing these systems, and why they need to change. And I think that kind of segues in nicely, Eric. I know you've done some research recently that has uncovered some pretty incredible finding as well with the Turing trap, that I also kind of tied to some of this negative sides of technology. I'd love if maybe you could answer by touching on some of that.
Sure. Well, I want to underscore what Elise and Kimberly said about the amplification of bias. I mean, most of these machine learning systems are trained on human data, and we humans are biased. And then when you codify that and amplify it, you can make it a lot worse and often harder to detect. You also, if it's done right, you can find ways of reversing that. And one of the things to do is for the designers of these systems to be more conscious of it. And my hope is that in the long run, we can reduce bias by having these systems more explicitly tuned in a way that they undo some of the bias that's existed in society since forever. But there are really at least half a dozen ways that technology is a serious threat in different ways. In addition to the amplification of bias, a lot of my work is focused on the disparate economic effects. And that paper you referred to, Kelsey, talks about what we call the Turing trap, that technology, when it automates work, can create a lot of value, but often that value becomes more and more centralized and more concentrated, and fewer people are participating in it. There's also, and we should talk about that more, but let me just list a few other areas. There are significant threats to privacy that are emerging, and this has become an area of research that's much more important in the past few years as people realize the power of technology to that. There are security risks. I'm just frightened when I see the cybersecurity risks that I see in banks and now geopolitical and national security aspects of it, because we're very dependent on our information systems in a way we weren't in the past. Another big area is the spread of misinformation and disinformation. The systems sometimes unintentionally amplify misinformation. They are often tuned to maximize engagement, which more often than not means maximizing outrage and anger, and that often correlates with misinformation. And finally, not to be totally ignored, the one that maybe has affected me the most is a lot of them have just become very distracting. I find that in my life, I have to think more carefully about trying to get my work done, write papers, as opposed to checking social media or whatever. And I think we have to learn some new norms about that. And again, it isn't always intentional. Sometimes it is intentional, but it can be. There's a kind of a digital addiction that is emerging. So these are all areas that are important. That said, I also want to just make sure I put in a good word for technology, because I don't want us to lose the big picture here. The reason that we have much longer lifespans and are much wealthier than our ancestors, 50 times wealthier than our ancestors, is mainly because of advances in technology. And done right, technology makes the pie bigger. So we don't want to stop technology. What we want to do is think of ways we can direct technology to harness some of these benefits while doing what we can to mitigate those harms that I listed and many others.
Thank you, Eric. And I appreciate you bringing us around to kind of acknowledge that there's obviously a lot of benefits as well. Now that we've kind of talked some about some of the negatives, I'd like to, switch gears a little bit to double click more into how can we actually harness technology as a positive. Elise, I'd love to start with you, and maybe if you can share and kind of walk through some of the work that you're doing at Praxis Labs that I think is having a huge impact in this space.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kelsey and Eric. That's really great pieces and points to highlight. But I do think technology can be a tool that produces equitable outcomes, helps increase inclusion and belonging. It's really tied to what we do at Praxis Labs. Praxis Labs at its core is an immersive learning company. We're focused on diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice topics with the goal of really driving change for individuals and organizations. We use virtual reality and mixed reality paired with learning and reflection on our platform and actionable insights to really drive that change. And so when I say mixed reality and immersive experiences, we essentially give opportunities for our learners to go through workplace scenarios, taking on a new perspective, encountering barriers to equity, and having to practice responding to them, whether it's at that interpersonal and behavioral level, so speaking out loud, giving feedback, calling someone into a conversation, or at that systemic and structural level, making decisions around policies and practices, seeing the impact of the decisions that you make, and getting to not just encounter that barrier to equity in that first person perspective, but also come back to that same scenario from the perspective of someone who's a bystander or someone complicit in that incident. So really helping folks to not just build empathy for the experiences of folks different than ourselves, but also to identify barriers to equity and to then practice responding to them and taking action. This idea that you can learn how to advocate on behalf of yourself even better, but also how to advocate on behalf of others and repair after you've made a mistake. And so what we found with our immersive learning platform and with our clients and partners has been this, one, I think so often technology is recreating some of these barriers. And what we found is that this creates an opportunity to get more proximate, to build muscles, to actually try to create comfort and confidence, taking action in equitable and inclusive ways.
It's the work you're doing is incredible, Elise, and it's amazing to hear about it. And how you're actually changing the way like DEI and these types of trainings are taught. So Kimberly, I'd love to kind of pivot to you next on this, especially since you've kind of been on both sides of this, both as an experienced leader in the engineering and technical space, holding various leadership roles in pharmaceutical and biotech companies, as well as leading the nonprofit sector. So I'd love to know in either of those industries, kind of where you've seen some of the positives and the benefits tied to technology.
Yes, I think one of the things that was really a highlight of my career was working in the biotech industry. I spent a good portion of my career in pharmaceutical industry and then switched in the latter part to biotech because of the novel therapeutic technology we could bring to market to solve these really serious issues and health disparities within the community. One of the reasons that I started Black Girls Code was that even within my biotech role in the latter part of my career, we were not at that time, now this was about 10 years ago, really using advanced technologies in ways that could reach a broader demographic. So 10 years ago, this was right at the emergence of mobile money. And I was seeing a lot of movement in the startup community around using technology in third world countries, et cetera, outside of the US, and innovating around mobile money, bringing technology to finance and fintech in a way that had not been done before. But there was not the same type of use case for health in the health community and health disparities. Nobody knew what health, no, very few people were talking about health tech in that way that it could really create more access for communities that were traditionally marginalized. So I left my corporate career in biotech actually with that in mind. I was going to start this health tech company. I really wanted to take advantage of mobile technology and use it in some of the same ways that I was seeing health actually impacting communities of color in my biotech company. And I diverged from that goal because I saw at the time that there weren't many women in these rooms and in these conferences and in these, I would say, networking events with other startup founders that looked like me. There are very few women, and there were also very few people of color. And that was something that I was not akin to, wasn't used to that because I came from a company that was very diverse and had many women in leadership roles. So I actually started Black Girls Code because from a career perspective, personally, I wanted to see more women in the role as founders and creators and innovators. At the same time, my personal life, my daughter was starting to develop this really intense interest in computer science as well. And as I had an opportunity and I certainly had access to put her in many programs to learn these tangible skill sets, I was pretty shocked that those rooms looked like just like my networking rooms. There were almost no girls in those rooms, and there were very few students of color. And I was like, we have a problem. There is absolutely a gap here that we're not training this next generation of innovators so that my daughter could be alone. She would not have a community. And it's important that Black women and women and people of color have a seat at the table as innovators, that we have this toolkit, because whether they go into computer science as a final career path or not, technology touches everything. I cannot think of a career path that technology doesn't touch in some way. And so this notion that I always use this quote from Douglas Rushkoff, code or be coded. We're either going to be the coders or we're going to be the ones that are being coded. And in every single example that Eric shared, we are being coded in every area, but we're not the ones usually that are writing the code. So my work and all of the work that I've done over the past 10 years and in the future is really about making sure there's access and a seat at the table for a diversity of voices and experiences to actually be a part of becoming the creators and not just being the consumers.
Thank you for sharing kind of your story and your journey and what actually drove you to pivot what your original career intentions were to go and help address this problem. It's clearly still an issue today, and it's amazing that we have people like you working on this. Eric, I'd like to, finish up with you here on, obviously, you've done a lot of work on this space and started to get into it a little bit, but on where do you see, more of the benefits and what we can be doing to harness the positives of technology as we move forward in society?
Well, a lot of my work is focused on the economic side, and all those other issues are also things that I think are super important. But let me just talk about the area I've been doing some research on, which is how technology, and especially recently digital technologies and even AI, have been creating a lot of wealth, record numbers of millionaires, billionaires. That's great in creating a lot of goods and services, but there's no economic law that everyone's going to benefit from that. It's possible for some people to be left out, or it's even possible for the technology to make some people worse off. And For most of the past couple hundred years, that's not what's been happening. But the past 20 or so years, unfortunately, there has been a growing inequality in the United States and other advanced countries. And there are many reasons for that. But part of it has to do with the way technology is being used. And that's something we can do a much better job on. The technology does not have to lead to more concentration of wealth. We've been looking at hundreds of millions of job postings and profiles. Now we have a lot of data that we didn't have in the past. So we can get really fine-grained on what's happening, and we can look at the skills that are becoming more valuable and less valuable. We can go through about 100 million job postings that come out that describe what is in demand. We have a project called Work to Vec that does that, that describes the space of jobs and how they're evolving. And what we're seeing is that there is this growing disparity in lots of different dimensions, as technology is often used to automate tasks as opposed to augmenting humans. Either approach actually can create a lot of money for their creators, but the second approach, augmenting or enhancing humans, also is more likely to create more widely shared prosperity. So one of the things that I've been writing about recently is what you mentioned at the beginning, Kelsey, that this Turing trap, the idea that if we do what's called the Turing test and try to imitate humans. That was something that Alan Turing developed in 1950, where the vision was, how can we make a machine that is identical, that imitates a human? It's kind of a cool sci-fi kind of idea, but now we're beginning to see machines that are more and more like that. The problem is that while that's intellectually interesting, from an economist perspective, it's actually the opposite of what you want to do. When you make a machine that does exactly what a human does, well, think about that. That makes the human labor less valuable. Mm-hmm. Another approach is to make machines that augment us. Machines can do many things we can't do. They can see X-rays, they can travel at supersonic speeds, they can do a million different things that we can't do. If you think about all the things that machines can do that humans can't do, that's where I'd like to see more computer scientists focusing their effort and using that to amplify and improve what we can do, solve new problems we never could have solved before. That focus isn't so focused on taking labor out, pushing down wages. Instead, it's focused on doing new and amazing things. So I've been going around to computer science conferences with this pitch. I'm writing about it to economists. I'm telling managers about it, and even policymakers. I was just meeting with some congressmen about that. And our current tax code, for instance, it's sad, but it puts the thumb on the scale towards capital against labor. Capital, as you probably know, is taxed at a much lower rate than labor is. If two entrepreneurs have billion-dollar ideas, the one that has more workers and more widely shared prosperity is going to be taxed more, and the one that concentrates wealth is going to be taxed less. I don't see any logical reason why we should skew the tax code that way towards concentrating wealth. And so there are lots of things we can do on the policy side as managers and as engineers and computer scientists to create not just prosperity, but shared prosperity.
Thank you for sharing and walking through that. I'm glad you brought up the tax code, because that was one of the most astonishing things that I think I read about in your research as well, is how that's actually tilted against human capital labor. And I think you really did an excellent job of kind of highlighting how if it's augmenting human tasks, there can be huge value to it rather than just replicating what human labor can already do. So on that note, I would like to kind of go more forward-looking, and just a reminder to all the attendees in the audience, feel free to submit questions in the chat. If you're in the room, we do have the QR code that you can go ahead and scan that is up on the screen. So forward-looking, and Eric, you kind of started this off, so I'll go to you first on this, is how can we best position ourselves to harness technology as a tool, and who should be thinking about this, across like the public sector, the private sector, as well as the social sector, and kind of in what ways? I know you teach a course on harnessing our digital future, so I'd love to hear a little more of your views on this.
And that's aimed at people like you, Kelsey, and all of the folks who are graduating from Harvard Business School and Sloan and Stanford and other schools and other managers, because first and foremost, I would say managers, entrepreneurs, they're the ones whose job it is to combine capital, labor, technology in different ways to create value. And it can be done in many different ways. We have a huge opportunity right now with these amazing technologies that have been invented over the past decade or so to put them to work and create a lot more productivity, invent new products and services. But, and I'm glad you have the social enterprise conference here right now. It can be done in a way that, as I said, creates inclusive innovation, shared prosperity. And what I'm hearing from more and more managers that I talk to is that they care about that as well as just maximizing profits. And one of the most damaging things that came out of my friend Michael Jensen's work at Harvard Business School, I was there visiting some years ago and worked alongside him, was this idea that the only purpose of managers or entrepreneurs was stockholder wealth. And I think that's economically incorrect, and it's also societally very damaging. So I'm glad that there's a big movement. I think I would say a majority of the people I talk to, I may get a biased sample, who understand that there's a responsibility to a lot more than stockholders when you use these technologies. Personally, I'm somewhat optimistic that the next decade is going to be perhaps the best decade we've had in human history in terms of improving life expectancy, better health outcomes, cleaner environment, and just more productivity overall. I'm not sure whether we can do all that while reducing inequality and making society fair. Well, let me just be clear. We certainly could do that. Whether we will do that, I'm not sure. But the more conferences like this we have, the more people who are consciously working toward it, the more likely we'll succeed on that goal as well. So if we hit both those targets, that would be a good decade.
Absolutely agreed on that one. Elise, I will go to you maybe next on this one. And also just curious, again, what probably a two-pronged question here as to how do you think we can best position ourselves? And then I would also, because you're working with some of the largest conglomerates in the world, I would love to know also, how do you see some of those big tech companies? Are they taking some of this seriously, especially within your realm of DEI? And do we think that the changes that they're making are enough, or do we see the traction to actually result in pretty substantial change?
Yeah, thank you so much, Kelsey. I think it really, to start with that first question of how do we best position ourselves to harness tech as a tool for good, I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier around who is in the room making decisions on what technology is created and how it is used and what is the purpose and the intended outcome. It's also about helping to those folks in the room who, whatever their background or experiences, is to unlearn and relearn. We are operating within systems of oppression and systems of inequity. And it is incredibly hard to know that you're in boiling water if you've been in boiling water your whole life. And so how do we think about putting ice cubes in, pouring out the water, doing something different and recreating in a way that is fundamentally different systems than what we've been working within. And so in my perspective, a lot of that is and this ties back to the partners we're working with. Society is more segregated now than it ever has been before. Our workplaces are often the most diverse spaces we enter. It's the first time we're asked to work across and interact across difference. And so, we don't innately know experiences that we aren't proximate to. We don't understand them. We don't necessarily see the impact of decisions we're making that might seem small, that actually are quite incredible for those folks on the receiving end of that. And so it's really, in my mind, and what we're seeing with our partners, about this unlearning and relearning. It's about focusing on systems and structures. We've seen our partners really narrow in on that, focusing on measurement, not just diversity measurement, which is incredibly important, but inclusion, belonging, ability to thrive, promotion, advancement, retention. It's recognizing that the way we've learned and unlearned is not necessarily what will help us move forward. One and done sessions on huge topics that take lifetimes to learn aren't going to necessarily help us move the needle. And it's going to require leadership and executives to be charging and driving this forward, because as much as I believe top down can make movements and we see it, there has to be leadership support, and there has to be, to Eric's point, it can't just be about our fiduciary stakeholders. It has to be about our broader society, our broader impact, because I think once we open the aperture, we'll see that the outcomes are actually benefit all of us, and much better and much much greater ways.
Thank you, Elise. I think you hit on some really powerful points there. That this is not a one and done type of thing. It's obviously lifelong learning that has to go into this, and not just measuring diversity, but also measuring all of those other outcomes that drive success is clearly very important in that space as well. Kimberly, I'd love to direct the same question to you as well on, how do we best position ourselves and who should be thinking about this between the private, public, and social sector, since I know you have pretty diverse experience.
Yes, I think, again, back to, when I started my nonprofit organization back in 2011 and 2012, this notion of the S Corp wasn't as, I would say, common in terms of a business model for many entrepreneurs. So part of the reason this, being a part of this conference today was so compelling for me is because it is about social enterprise and social entrepreneurs. And like, that wasn't an option that I had. Like I looked into it, I asked people about it because I did not just want to have an organization that focused on shareholder value without really considering the impact on my environment and community. And the only other model that was clearly an option to me at that time, that was a clear path to doing the work I wanted to do, was to create a nonprofit, because it was still, very early for S Corps. So I think now, over the last 10 years, I've seen such a sea change. I've seen many more entrepreneurs coming together who want to do good as well as do well, and have seen a path to do that in this model of creating an S Corp or social enterprise. At the same time, I absolutely agree with what some of my other panelists have mentioned about this notion of, or maybe a question that I saw, how do we decouple and share ownership and equity in the future of technology? Absolutely, the reason, I know it's controversial depending on which room that you're in, but I am bullish on Web3. And I have been bullish about Web3 since I attended a blockchain conference in Prague back in 2018. And when the blockchain was really described to me, I had a light bulb moment, and I was like, this is what freedom looks like, right? It's how do we deconcentrate power into technology space from the major companies who are VC-backed companies who are there to do one thing, and that is to return outside gains to their owners and investors. I was like, we need this blockchain, and we all need to be part of the blockchain. I think, looking at where we go from Web 2 to Web 3 and really being able to envision a future in technology where there is not a concentration of ownership, that is what freedom looks like. That is how we get more folks to equitably distribute some of the wealth that is absolutely going to continue to be created in the technology field. Now, there are bad actors in Web3 now. We're seeing some of those folks from Web2 bringing the same practices right into Web3. And it's a bit of a land grab, a virtual land grab, if you will, that is commencing right now. But I think, it is important because this is an inflection in time that I believe in technology where we have to get a front of this movement with as many diverse creators and entrepreneurs and women as we possibly can, so that we don't repeat the mistakes that we made over the last several decades.
Thank you for sharing that, and wholeheartedly agree with everything you shared there. I think it really stands out the importance of needing to decouple and share ownership and create equity across technology. I'd also just like to double click and kind of ask you another question there, Kimberly, and you touched on this slightly on, when you started Black Girls Code, there wasn't really the option of going the S Corp route as much. Now that things have changed over the past 10 years a little bit, I'd be curious to get your take on, do you see where do you see more impact actually getting driven? Is it in the nonprofit sector that's 100% mission driven and able to fully execute on what they're working towards? Or do you see more of the for-profit sector that may have more resources available, but has I would say, a double bottom line practice, more likely to kind of create more impact in space?
Yeah, I've thought a lot about that, over the last year, especially, and I think that the nonprofit model is very beneficial from the standpoint that it is mission driven. We are focused on strategy and delivering results to benefit our communities, which is great. However, I think that the model in and of itself is only about 200 years old in practice. There are gaps there and inequities, which make it very difficult to do work that we need to do to serve our communities, because you're in a bit of a hamster wheel. Like, you're as traditionally under resourced, and they're the same things, or there's some big players that have lots of resources, and there are a lot of these smaller community organizations that are under resourced but highly leveraged because there's such a demand for what we do. So putting all of this work from that should in some cases really be in the social sector onto nonprofits is not a good way to do business. On the other hand, I don't see that work that we do that is socially good necessarily being done by for-profit companies, because that is not what their goal is. Their goal is to make money. So I think this S corp notion sits right in the middle of that. But I think it takes all players, right? All the pieces matter. There is a role for government and social programs. There is a role for nonprofits. There is a role for profit or S corporations to all do this collective work and responsibility to move the needle where it needs to go. But it can't all be in one sector. There needs to be a redistribution of this work to really move us all forward in the future, if that makes sense. I think there's a place for us all, but I think right now, too much of the work of doing the good has been put on nonprofit organizations that are under resourced. That doesn't make any sense. It's about time that we push back on some of this work going into truly social good, social governmental programs where it should be in some cases. I shouldn't have to be the one to teach all the Black girls in the country how to code. Why is that not in schools? Like, that is the work is where it should be. I should be here just to supplement and do what the school is not able to do. I shouldn't have to do it all. And I think really having a conversation of what it looks like about what equitable work and responsibility looks like across all sectors is a conversation we need to have.
Thank you for sharing your perspective on that. And, I think there is probably an argument to be made that some of that is the outcome of late stage capitalism, where too much is being put on the nonprofit sector. But given the interest of time here, I'd like to switch over to the Q&A, because we've been getting a lot of great questions from our audience. So this will be a little bit more rapid fire on whoever wants to talk to these ones. So the first question we have here is an interesting one. So it seems that Congress, from congressional hearings, doesn't have expertise or speed to accurately regulate and implement tech policy. Who should write the rules? I don't know if anyone... Eric, I know you might have an opinion.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I've had a number of meetings with people at lots of different levels of government, and unfortunately, it's true. It's pretty disappointing, the level of expertise by a lot of people in Congress. There are a few people like Mark Warner and Ro Khanna and others who have made some big investments in getting up to speed in these areas. But it's not an option to take that power away from Congress. So I think the only option is to educate them better. We had a program actually at Stanford, the biggest program for Congress to learn about these topics, scheduled for last fall. I think it was November. And unfortunately, just before we were going to do it, there was the debt ceiling crisis, and everyone had to stay in Congress. So we had to cancel that. It's hard to schedule these things sometimes. So we did not get a chance to run that program. Maybe we'll run it again during a future congressional break. But I think voters need to look at the elected representatives' technical expertise, if they would, and elect people who have some competence in those areas. And once they get in office, there's the staff and others that can learn. But ultimately, it's going to be their call. The White House has been a little better. I've been to a number of AI summits in the White House, and they have a little more freedom to pick a lot of people who do have expertise and bring them in. And there's a national AI strategy that I think is looking very promising. Also, because more and more people in government have been concerned about the challenge from China and the improvements in AI in China, both military and otherwise. that has raised the level of interest and awareness and funding. So all those things are kind of tilting us towards improving the expertise, but it has a long way to go.
Yeah, I would add to that and something that I've been ranting about on my social as of late is that we are experiencing a generational shift in the U.S. and in the world. Now, I am a Gen Xer, and I'm on the tail end of that scale. But when I look at my legislators and the folks that are Congress people, they're much older as a generation than me. And they're making a lot of rules and they're making a lot of decisions with lack of context and lack of knowledge to do so. And so I think we need to really reconsider like who sits in that seat of authority and power. And we need folks that are from the next several generations. We need millennials in there. We need Gen Z. Like, why are they not there? Because these decisions that are being made, they're going to impact them well more than they will impact me within my lifetime. These are digital natives. They understand technology in a way that even those in my generation never will because they grew up with it. They need to be the ones that are in those seats making those decisions and not just have it be on the onus on us to teach a generation that I don't want to be derogative, but like we need to not necessarily have to teach them. We need leaders that come with a certain set of knowledge base already to lead us forward in what the future should looks like. So I think it's very important for younger legislative leaders and Congress people to take the helms of our governmental policies and really move us forward into the future. Like that is what I want. That is what I'm looking for. And that's why I'm doing the work that I've been doing over the last 10 years to create those leaders.
Thank you. And I think that's a very excellent point as well, that we're going to need some shifts in legislation in order to affect these changes that we're hoping to get. Another question we got from the audience here is, how do startups grapple with balancing the goals of systemic social impact with expectations from VC funders / stockholders for exponential growth? So feel free to answer, but Elise, maybe starting off with you, given that you are the CEO of a startup that is probably dealing with this.
Yes. So Praxis Labs is a VC-backed startup, and so I think it's something we think about all the time. In my mind, it's really about aligning yourself with folks who are values aligned with the mission and the impact you're trying to have. If you are taking money from folks who are saying, all right, here are the things that we expect, and that is misaligned with the impact you want to have, you should not take that money, because that they are being honest with what their bar is. I think what's harder to do is when folks are saying, oh yeah, we definitely care about that, but it's really that second layer of how do they put into action their care? Are they doing the things that, one of our investors has their full process on their website, Ulu Ventures, and they have a process that they keep consistent for every investment that they make, and they go through a market map, and they have tutorials online of what it looks like and how to prepare to reduce the lack of clarity or transparent, or to increase the transparency of what that process looks like, so that more folks can understand and know what to expect and do well and get that funding that they need for their business. But I think for Praxis, we are honest with our investors. We start every presentation with, Praxis Labs, our mission is to make society more equitable. We believe we'll chip away at that through our theory of change, and very much nonprofit language, because this impact goal is inherent to who we are and what we do. It's why the team comes to work every day. We're an incredibly diverse team, and so for me, and to that team piece, even not just exponential growth in terms of revenue or financial outcomes, but growth in teams. Folks are like, hire quick and, just make sure you get people in the seats. And it's like, no. We will be doing this in a structured, systemic way. We're going to have rubrics and scoring, and it's going to take maybe a little bit longer for us to fill these roles, but it's because we're going to do it in a way that is aligned with our values, and that is aligned with our mission, and aligned with who we want to be and what we want not just our company to look like, but every company to look like.
If I could just add to that, everyone listening to this should go back and re-listen to Elise on tape, because I think she's got it exactly right. There doesn't have to be a conflict between growth and values and doing the right thing if you pull together a group of people who are aligned with you, as Elise and Kimberly are doing. So that includes not just investors, but we're seeing that employees, people graduating from Harvard and other places, they say one of the most important things to them is doing right by the world. And so a company that shares their values is going to be able to attract the best and the brightest. Customers care a lot about it. So I think there's nothing wrong with pulling together an organization of people who are like-minded and working to change the world. It's what we've been doing for a long time, and it's why I disagree so much with that stockholder mentality. I'll just tell a quick story. I was looking at a few years ago about a stockholder meeting at Apple, which is not a small company. I think it's the most valuable company on the planet. And Tim Cook was describing how they had developed some tools for disabled people to use their iPhone more effectively. And one of the stockholders stood up and said, the cost benefit just isn't there. That's a tiny market, and you're spending a lot of money, and you're using our shareholders' money for a product that isn't going to return value to us. You shouldn't be doing that. And Tim Cook said, well, that's what we do. And if this is what Apple its mission is, that's what our employees want to do. That's what our other customers want to do. That's what the other stockholders want to do. If you don't want to be part of it, sell your shares, go somewhere else. And I think that's exactly the right attitude. There's no inherent conflict. You just, people who have a certain set of values can band together and do wonderful things. And if other people don't want to be part of it, nobody's forcing them.
Mm-hmm. I would just add to pinpoint that takes a courageous leader to do that. And so I want to also give kudos to Elise for standing your ground and building a company built on values, because oftentimes, we don't get a chance to stand up that way as a leader and make that bold decision to build a company based on values, because we often get a lot of pressures from boards and stakeholders to not do so. And so I think it's encouraging for me to hear and see is that young founders like Elise, as well as students from Stanford, are coming out saying they want to do good. And I would encourage them, especially if they are watching this now and in this conference, don't lose that. Keep that same notion, keep pushing, because that's what we need.
All right. I think all three of you really hit on some key points there. And given that I know we're already 10 minutes over our scheduled time, I think it's probably prudent for us to wrap up here. And I think that was a really great note for us to end on. I really want to thank all three of you, Kimberly, Elise, Eric, for being here today, and everyone watching this as well. I think we were really able to dig in deep on an incredibly complex topic. And it's amazing to have these conversations on the pros and the cons. And clearly there's a lot of work that still needs to be done to create a more equitable society and leverage technology as a tool to advance us towards that. But it's good that we're having these conversations here. So I'd like to thank everyone again for coming today, and a reminder that we will be on a networking break until 3:55 p.m. Eastern time, when we will be rejoining. Thank you
so much. Thanks
for
organizing.
Bye.
Such a privilege to be here in conversation. Thanks so much.
Absolutely.